Um, yeah, I mean, I want to ask about the Biden reforms. I share your surprise. I mean, I did not expect these, trillions and trillions of dollars in social spending, and I want to believe that the effect of the twin Bernie Sanders campaigns, things like Jacobin, all this kind of new left energy that has emerged in the United States, which is quite new given what the state of the left was in the early 2000s or the 90s and things like that. How much is a result of that, and how much is a result of just the depth of the crisis post 2008, the structural kind of just the structural institutional crisis that we're facing? I mean, how much are those twin forces, and do they reinforce each other? Maybe is the question.
Yeah, I think this is a kind of an all of the above situation. It's odd. I know several people who are among Biden's economic advisors. I know them from my old radical economic circles, and here they are advising Joe Biden. I'm sure they've moderated their message some, but the fact that people that left are now in positions of power. You could be cynical and say that they're there to be silenced, but I think they're also seeing their influence in this trillions of dollars of social spending. I think the Sanders campaign was really brought a whole set of issues to the surface, and the growth of DSA and Jacobin. I think we should be proud of this and take some credit for it, and maybe even exaggerate our role in that if necessary. It doesn't hurt to take credit where it's due, or even not where it's entirely due. But there's also the depths of the crisis. And there's a COVID crisis, which really demanded ambition. It was so challenging to the stability of the system, legitimacy of the system, and to watch people dying in the hundreds of thousands. And to see the Trump administration so indifferent to that. I think there's certain portions of civilized society that were recoiled at that and figured we needed to do something about that. There's also the threat of China. I think Hillary Clinton gave a really rabid, hawkish address to the Chatham House, which is the British equivalent of the Council on Foreign Relations, very elite foreign policy think tank, where she was going on about the evil China. It was kind of frightening. She wanted to take back the means of production from China, which is
so good.
A strange thing. I can think of better ways to deal with the means of production, but than to have. I don't know who was going to do this. Who would be the agents of this take back? But certainly not the proletariat in her view. But right. I think the threat of China, which has in many ways, it's an appalling regime, but on the other hand, they're very good at what they do. They've really generated the most intense and dramatic period of economic growth over decades that the world has ever seen. They're gaining in technological power. They're no longer just this low-wage workshop. They're developing their own autonomous technological capacities, and they're becoming an increasing political and possibly military rival to the United States. So I think they realize, at least the more sophisticated among them, realize that some kind of more coherent state response is necessary. The market won't take care of this. And also they see, they're I think, concerned about social disintegration. Even among the more sophisticated people in finance and the people who think for people in finance, they're concerned that the level of polarization and desperation is a real threat to the long-term stability of the system. And I think all these things together are really pushing some kind of move in a somewhat better direction. It's not eco-socialism by any means, but it's certainly better than anything one could have imagined a year ago. And, I think we just need to push harder and get more of it. And it's very popular. People want this stuff. The Biden proposals poll at 60% or more. It's not, and so the Republicans are just yammering on about critical race theory. While Joe Biden is sending you $1,400 checks. They're kind of weak at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to see more of that from Biden. I think that's the right strategy for the Democratic Party. And it's been kind of surprising because I had incredibly low expectations for the Biden administration. And to be fair, some of his proposals have been good. I'd like to see more, but pretty good.
Yeah. Well, like I say, we should take
yeah.
credit for it and demand more, because it's obviously popular. People like it.
Oh,
People like
absolutely.
Medicare for all. There are all kinds of things that they're not doing that could be done. And we should push for more. And at some point, we're going to see a backlash, I guess, from, the Jamie Dimon circle, but we're not there yet.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I want to just quickly comment on Hillary Clinton's hawkish China speech. Well,
that's really scary. She's terrifying.
She is terrifying, especially on foreign policy. But it's interesting because during the Trump administration, Trump would get a lot of backlash in the corporate media over the fact that he would create problems, and then he would give himself credit for trying to solve the problems that he created. Like, for instance, his awful tweets with Kim Jong-un early in his presidency, and then he wanted to give himself a pat on the back when he when he wanted to engage diplomatically. I mean, this is the same thing with the Clinton administration, engaging in these free trade agreements, which ended up obviously putting U.S. workers at a giant disadvantage. And now she's talking about, taking back the means of production. It's ridiculous. Anyway, just a comment on that. But the question that I wanted to ask you has to do with our financial system, because, 3 years ago, you did this great interview on C-SPAN. I was watching it earlier today, and you talked about how the stock market is really overvalued. So when people talk about the stock market as a metric for economic success, it really makes no sense. A big part of the reason why it's overvalued is because the Federal Reserve is printing money, giving it to the banks, and they're investing in their own stocks. And so lately, there's been more and more talk by Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen in regard to increasing interest rates. I wanted to get your thought on that, considering everything in context with our financial system.
Yeah, the stock market was overvalued 3 years ago, and it's just comically overvalued now. It's like really without precedent. I mean, if you look at some measures that go back into the 1870s, the stock market has never been so highly valued. So it's madness. But as you say, a very important reason for that is trillions and trillions of dollars from the Federal Reserve, just free money they've pumped into the financial system. And that has just helped drive stock prices higher. But it's also just unleashed a whole multitude of speculative bubbles of the sort. I don't recall seeing this many simultaneous bubbles that all going on at once. Either through what I've lived through or what I've read about. It's just usually there's one instrument. Like in the early mid 2000s, it was housing. In the late 90s, it was the stock market. Now we've got stocks. We've got housing. We've got DogeCoin. We've got sneakers. We've got everything has been turned into a speculative asset, and all kinds of people are getting involved in this game who've never been involved before. And it's not going to end well. Can't predict how it's going to end or when it's going to end, but it seems like it's going to end very badly because there's just a whole lot of people pouring a lot of money into markets they don't really understand and think they can somehow get rich. But yeah, I think that the Federal Reserve has kind of painted itself into a corner. I can understand why they started pumping all this money in to start with, because everything seemed to be falling apart. But it's hard to stop. And I think they understand that if they start making noise about stopping, the markets will panic and sell off, and they'll be afraid that we'll have a crash. And so what do they do then? Do they let the crash go on, or do they pump in more money? I don't know. They're really in a difficult position. And now we're also seeing households, American households, certainly not people at the who have been struggling to make ends meet, but people in the middle and higher have been saving enormous amounts of money during the pandemic. They've saved their stimulus checks. They've had fewer things to spend money on. So people who stayed employed have just been building up their bank accounts. Something like $2 trillion in various forms of aid went to households over the last year or so, which is they ended up saving about almost close to 20% of it. So it's very likely we're going to see a real spending boom later in the year, which could unleash inflation, which will make the markets and elites very nervous. So they're going to have a real difficulty on their hands coming up. And it's really hard to exit from one of these speculative bubbles, especially one that's just so gigantic and so unprecedented and so pervasive.
Yeah, I think related to that speculative bubble. I mean, you joked about Bitcoin, and I remember a piece you wrote about Bitcoin. Maybe a year or two ago that I remember having a big influence on me. Because I know a lot of people who have gotten pretty rich, like idiots who've gotten very, very rich on Bitcoin. I have a friend in Miami who just sold an NFT for $6 million. And I just
God.
I don't know what to do. And now, like, in my day job, I deal with a lot of these ruling class types. And the hottest thing in the world right now for these people is the SPAC. And I barely understand it. And you're the left guy who understands these kind of things. So I've been wanting to ask you about it. What is a SPAC? What is it? What the hell's going on underneath it all? Like, what is behind this kind of hot new trend? And what does it say about the health of our economy and financial markets? I can't believe I can't imagine it's a good thing.
Bill, a SPAC is what is it? Special Purpose Acquisition Corporation is what it stands for. It's what used to be called the blank check company. And the classic example that's always quoted in any commentary on these sorts of things is from the 1720 South Sea bubble in England. A company, there was a circular advertising, a company for carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. And that's exactly what these things are. There's some management team or an individual manager who has some kind of star reputation, or although I guess as these things progress, they get more and more mined from the bottom of the barrel. But they say, give us some money and we'll find a company to take over and everyone will be happy. And we'll make you a lot of money. The sponsors of these things always make a lot of money. They take out a lot of money off the top. And whether their outside investors are going to make any money is dubious. I mean, there's been some recent studies that show they're actually not making money. They're losing money, but that doesn't stop people from, pumping more money into a thing because they think it's going to get them rich. But basically the idea is you set up this pool of money, and now there are hundreds and hundreds of these things, but you set up this pool of money that's going to prowl for a company to take over, and everybody's going to get rich and be happy as a result of that. The most extreme example of this emerged over the last couple of weeks is this deli in southern New Jersey, had something like $13,000 in annual sales that suddenly ended up being valued at $2 billion because it was really the
Wow.
front for a takeover operation. And this guy, some hedge fund manager, the name escapes me now, wrote it. It came to everyone's attention because this hedge fund manager wrote it up. He said the pastrami must be really good to have a valuation of $2 billion. But no, it seems to be some kind of operation that is looking to be a SPAC and take over some other company, but nobody really knows. But this is the kind of stuff that happens in a crazy bubble, like just nonsense like that. And people who are buying Bitcoin, the people who are involved in GameStop a few months ago. It's just an awful lot of money chasing idiotic ideas that really don't do any good for humanity and will leave a lot of people broke at the end of it. But the way these things operate is that you see some other guy getting rich and you say, well, I got to do this too. And if you get your timing right, you may, make yourself a little rich as well. But if you don't, you're going to be left holding the empty bag. The NFT thing is also amazing because,
Yeah. Can you
trying,
talk about that a little bit? Yeah.
Well, they're trying to commodify and make unique an infinitely reproducible asset. Like a JPEG, you can reproduce that any number of times at no cost, and it doesn't reduce. If somebody has a copy of my JPEG, it doesn't reduce my enjoyment of my JPEG. Whatever that might be. But they're trying to make something so worthless, somehow unique and valuable. It's just utterly remarkable to watch this stuff. And they're environmentally disastrous. The NFT, the technology behind the NFT uses lots and lots of power. Bitcoin uses just tons and tons of electricity, pumps out enormous amounts of carbon. But somehow it gives the impression to people of being completely immaterial because it just lives virtually. But they're extraordinarily wasteful and pointless. So you get this JPEG or whatever the NFT is, and somehow you own it, whatever that means, because Nobody can stop it from being copied. So what
Right.
this ownership means, why people are willing to spend, what was that artwork that sold for 60 or 70 million dollars?
$79 billion or $69 billion, something like that. I'm
Million,
saying one of my million. One of my friends bought an NFT for like $40 or $50,000 a year ago and sold it 2 months ago for $6 million. And it's like, you know, his point is like, yeah, I can walk up to the Mona Lisa at the Louvre and snap a picture of it, and you can Google the Mona Lisa's picture and print it out, and you can look at it on your computer whenever you want. But that is not as valuable as the original Mona Lisa. And I was like, I don't know how to answer that other than like, it just, I don't know. It's not the same thing, man. It's just not the same thing.
Yeah, no, the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction needs a sequel. It's just, we're really in a very strange world. But, you know, the Mona Lisa, presumably seeing a painting in person, you get to see, you know, the effects of the brushwork and subtleties that can't be reproduced on a computer screen. But, you know, this NFT, this artwork is purely digital. That's its original form. But you're somehow trying to make something essentially worthless in an economic sense scarce and valuable, and it just leaves me speechless. Really, it's bonkers. Why people would spend $60 or $70 million? And I noticed that although I think the Beeple, that's his name, right? The artist.
Yeah.
We just saw that on the screen.
Yeah.
I believe he got Ethereum or wanted to be paid in Ethereum.
Yeah.
But Christie's wanted to be paid in US dollars. Christie's that handled the auction wanted real money.
Mm-hmm. Jeez. You know, earlier you talked about multiple bubbles taking place simultaneously. And one of the bubbles that's pretty clear to me is this housing bubble that is driven up by these private equity firms who could be extremely over leveraged. I was wondering if you could weigh in on that and what you predict is likely going to happen with the housing market, if you have a prediction.
Well, yeah, the housing market is being driven by several things. Of course, there was the escape from the cities during the COVID crisis, which has been driving people around New York into the Hudson Valley, which is rapidly becoming unaffordable. I saw a statistic the other day that said, I think Bloomberg ran this, based on cost relative to income, Orlando is now more unaffordable than San Francisco as a housing market.
Oh, yeah.
So people have been moving to these smaller cities or resort areas outside major cities, driving up the price for the locals and making it absolutely impossible for them to live. There was another story the other day about the Vermont bread company collapsing, and there was some effort to get Bread Alone, which is a bakery based in the Hudson Valley, to take its place, to serve some of its customers. And the Bread Alone people said they couldn't do it because they can't get the workers, because no workers can afford to live there anymore in the Hudson Valley. And they were thinking of actually buying an apartment building so they could rent to their workers so they could afford to live there. So, this the housing bubble is unlike the one of 10, 15 years ago. That was being driven by lots of people borrowing too much money and that they eventually couldn't afford. This is, in many cases, rich people going into small towns, buying up things for cash. And then, as you mentioned, the private equity guys, they generally like to pick up the pieces after things collapse. So that's what they did after the 2008 housing crisis. They bought up a lot of housing, turned it into rental housing, and as is typical with private equity, they cut back on services, cut back on quality, jacked up rents, and made themselves a lot of money, but screwed the tenants. Now they also seem to be buying lots of housing. A large percentage of transactions now are going off on a cash basis, not which means that they're probably rich institutional investors getting heavily involved in the housing markets. But you hear stories of people going to look at a house and its price rising $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 in just a couple of days. I talked to a friend of mine who was looking for a house in Philadelphia, and one of the conditions now seems to be that you want to let the people that you're buying the house from live there for a month or two. They don't have to leave yet, so you just have to cool your heels. It's an insanely hot market, and this is one of the things that strikes me as the pure irrationality of capitalism. Now, we think of a healthy housing market conventionally as one in which prices are rising, but housing is one of life's essentials. We don't want we don't want it to be turned into a speculative asset. We don't want it to be priced out of the reach of ordinary people. But that's what's been happening all over the country, in places, small towns, medium-sized cities, distant resorts, all over the place. People who live there are being priced out, and it's just utter madness. And how will it end? I don't know. I mean, it's just one of these things. Like I said, it's such a comprehensive speculative mania going on, that it's really hard to find any kind of precedent for it. And another thing that happens in speculative bubbles, that there's a famous saying from Warren Buffett: you don't know who's swimming without shorts until the tide goes out. And there's an awful lot of people probably who are operating on really high leverage to play all these games, whether it's Ethereum or housing in the Hudson Valley, or crazy speculative stocks or sneakers, or whatever that they're speculating in. We're going to find out that an awful lot of people have been borrowing lots of money to speculate, and while prices are going up, nobody notices. But once things start going down, that's when everyone notices how many heavily leveraged actors there are. There's a hedge fund that failed just a couple of weeks ago. I think Acheron, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, that had been funded heavily by a bunch of big banks, Credit Suisse among them. And apparently they had no idea how much this hedge fund had borrowed, how much it was on the hook for. And when it failed, it caused big losses at some of these banks. And this is just one relatively small hedge fund in a time when other hundreds of them are not failing. So if you started seeing, this become a trend, if you started seeing a bunch of hedge funds failing and asset prices falling, then we're going to see an awful lot of people exposed as being very, very heavily leveraged. Going into this, it seemed like the banking system was in much better shape than it was 10, 15 years ago. And some of the Dodd-Frank reforms kept them from doing the more egregious stuff. But then there are an awful lot of other actors besides the banks who've been hedge funds and private equity guys who've been doing very reckless things. So we're going to find out an awful lot of carnage in the coming, who knows, 6 months, 6 years, I don't know, but it's going to be ugly.
I just spent 10 days in my hometown of Miami. I got back just a few days ago, and I can't stress enough just how insane it is there right now. Just the housing market is like on fire. And it's just everything. Like Miami is just kind of like the NFT Bitcoin speculative craze in one city, just kind of all happening at the same time, and it's very apparent.
Miami has a long history of that sort of thing, right?
Yes, they do. I want to just close out, Doug. You've been very generous with your time on your reaction to the jobs report that came out this week. It was lower than anticipated by a lot of people. It was like somewhat disappointing by a lot of people. Conservatives have been blaming the dole, the generous unemployment insurance for disincentivizing people to get back to work. But even some liberals have jumped on that train. I saw Noah Smith wrote a big piece saying that it's time to end the unemployment, the coronavirus unemployment insurance. What is your reaction to the jobs report and this line of attack?
Well, it was surprisingly weak, and it's not entirely clear what happened. Also, I would say not to draw too many conclusions from 1 month's report. These things get revised. Who knows what next month will bring? There's a tendency to just draw out major stories based on rather thin evidence. So who knows whether this is the beginning of a weakening trend in the recovery, or if it's just anomaly. But I don't buy the argument that it's the overly generous unemployment checks. There's really no evidence for that. And people who study this find that there's just no geographic pattern based on the generosity of the checks that would confirm the pattern in employment. No sectoral pattern either. The strongest sector in that employment report was bars and restaurants, who added almost 200,000 new jobs. So, this is where we hear all these restaurateurs having trouble finding employees, but they're still hiring very aggressively. I think that this is a situation though where the restaurant industry, which is, I guess, the one that's complaining most loudly, has been notorious for low pay and crappy working conditions and rude bosses. And it's quite possible that a lot of people who lost their jobs in restaurants during the pandemic have decided to move on to another line of work. That may be the part of the problem. And if they have trouble finding people to work for $10 an hour, I don't know, maybe $15 an hour might bring people in. And if you can't pay the $15, then maybe you really don't deserve to exist. That's one of the things that the old Swedish social democrats used to say, that if you can't pay a good wage, then you do not deserve to exist. And I think there's a lot of we overly romanticize small businesses in a lot of cases in the United States. And I can understand the informality, and they're kind of cute. We all like our nice little restaurants, but if they're not capable of paying a living wage, then they really have no way to justify their existence. But I think as the year goes on, we're going to still continue to see job growth, employment growth, and as I mentioned earlier, households have all this money to spend, so that's going to start hitting pretty hard pretty soon. So I wouldn't say that this is a really big change, but it was kind of strange. There was an argument going into that employment report that we don't need all these stimulus bills. We don't need, Biden's infrastructure proposal. We don't need all the social spending. We don't need, all the spending on childcare. Because the economy is healing on its own. I think that the April employment report put that line to sleep for at least a little while. So I guess they're seizing upon the overly generous unemployment checks as their mode of attack. But I think we obviously, the kinds of infrastructure and social spending packages that Biden is talking about are for the long term, not matters of short-term fiscal stimulus. What 1 month's employment report doesn't really change those long-term patterns to return to where we started. It doesn't change the long-term patterns of social and physical rot in the United States, and what we need to do is have a longer-term set of policies to address that social and physical rot, and these are good steps in that direction. And one good or bad unemployment report or employment report really doesn't change that picture.
All right. Everyone, hopefully you took advantage of our $1 subscription sale, so you can check out Doug's piece, Take Me to Your Leader, The Rot of the American Ruling Class. Doug, you're amazing. Thank you so much for taking so much time to speak with us today. It was an absolute pleasure.
Oh, my pleasure too. Anytime.
All right. Take care.